going to discuss community culture in the context of urban-rural systems. And we'll start with just some broad definitions, some fairly typical kind of definitions you might find in an intro to sociology textbook, where culture is defined as beliefs, values, norms, lifestyles, customs, heritage, history, language, and material artifacts. And that's, of course, all those are pretty broad concepts, but material artifacts, those are the physical things we see, such as the artifacts we see on the left side of this slide. But the clothes we wear, the food we eat, that's all material. And a lot of times they reflect the unseen values, norms, etc. of the culture. Communities have cultures. Um, Sometimes local communities will have a culture that's markedly different than the wider region or neighboring communities, and sometimes communities will have cultures that make them look a lot like their neighbors. So that all varies externally. And then internally, communities may be rather homogeneous, having basically one kind of shared culture, or they can be diverse, having multiple cultures. And if they're diverse, the subcultures uh, could be along ethnic lines, as is often common, or religious groups. Countercultures are those subcultures that have values, beliefs, and norms that run counter to those of the dominant culture. And that can happen too. Community identity is an important concept, and we'll come back to in this presentation. It's tied to local cultural distinctiveness. So, what makes a place unique is kind of an important question when we're thinking about community identity. And again, culture is quite layered. We can talk about a local culture, a regional culture, national, and some even talk about a global culture. But that's getting pretty large. Now, we're staying mostly at the local level in this presentation. We're thinking about socialization as the process by which culture comes into us, the way we internalize culture. And that has some formal channels, such as schooling. We attend school, and one of the main functions of school is cultural transmission. But we also receive a lot of informal training from our family, friends, and other agents of socialization. And essentially, we don't often think about it, but we're a reflection of the very place where we are being socialized. So it's all highly dependent on the context of a particular culture. Another important concept is cultural legacy, and this has to do with history and narrative, and essentially most communities have some sense of where they came from, so sort of an origin story. And they also have their significant events, including the founding of the community, but perhaps their wars fought there, important people, maybe celebrities, and important sites, such as the homes of famous people. So all that becomes part of the cultural legacy. And, you know, different communities have different levels of historical distinctiveness. Some communities go to great lengths to talk about their history, others don't go to much effort at all. So there's a range. So the question is, how will communities participate in creating this historical distinctiveness, this local identity, and this cultural legacy? So when we're thinking about community culture, it does really help to think about urban-rural patterns and cultural differences. We have the classic writings on this from Zimmel, who wrote Metropolis and Mental Life, who contrasted the blasé attitudes of urban people who have to deal with constant sensory overload given their environments, and also the kind of alienating anonymity that comes with being one person among millions at times. And it can be a very lonely kind of existence, as Zimmel points out. So he's really interested in the social psychology of urban rural life and how the culture feeds into that. He also thought that rural people could often feel suffocated or that they didn't have enough freedom or room to be individuals. So whereas you can be a total individual in an urban setting, you might not even be noticed. In a rural setting, there's a lot more pressure to conform and be more like everybody else at times. Now, these are pretty broad, sweeping patterns. They certainly do not apply to all urban and rural places, but these are some of the early ideas set forth by Zimmel. And Tönnies, whose Gemeinschaft and Gesellschaft are German words that roughly translate to community and society, also have kind of a rural and urban interpretation. Communities kind of implying rural, whereas society is implying urban society. And Tunney suggested that this Gemeinschaft, or community, or rural existence, is dominated by what he called the rational will, which is people, and sorry, that's Gesellschaft, that's urban society is dominated by the rational will. People are logical and calculating, they're not very personal, but the rural communities tend to be more social and friendly. Uh, Natural will is what he called that. So the normative and rational behavior that people exhibit is highly context specific and has a lot to do with local cultural conditions. Is there a norm for sociability, for instance? Is there an expectation that if you run into somebody or anybody you're doing business with, are you going to engage in some kind of social conversation, or is it just going to be sort of a transaction, right? And Weber, who was another classic sociologist, suggested society in general was moving towards this iron cage of rationality, and that transactional interaction was becoming more normal as bureaucracies became more widespread and as urbanization continued to expand. So what that meant is a more kind of impersonal experience. Uh, Louis Werthe, I know it looks like Worth, it's a German pronunciation. He wrote another classic essay called Urbanism as a Way of Life while he was at the University of Chicago, an important school that we'll also talk about elsewhere. For him, he made a distinction between the physical geography of cities as urban and the kind of cultural way of life that you know, comes along with living in a city but transcends the city. So he called that urbanism. And in fact, he suggests that urbanism can eventually spill over into the surrounding suburbs and even to the countryside. Another insight Werthe offered was the segmentalization of human relations, which has to do with the idea that in urban settings, people tend to know only one small fragment of other people, and it's based on the tie they have to each other. So if you might know somebody from work, and that's all you know about them is their role and their personality at work. You might know somebody through a club of some kind. Maybe you both belong to the same gym, and all you have in common is the gym itself. So you don't know anything else about the person, and so on. So it's, we just know little bits and pieces about everyone, and we don't really know anybody in their totality. So that's something that, of course, implicit in that is that in rural areas, people tend to know each other more holistically. Again, these are theoretical ideas, maybe a little bit sweeping, but they offer us some insights that have some value to this day. The terms urbane and rustic are also useful for distinguishing when we're talking about urban and rural as a cultural phenomenon. So, of course, urbane is how we describe urban culture, and rustic, rural culture. And so, sometimes the words urban and rural usually they often imply just the population density of a place. So that isn't what we always mean. So the culture, we can be more careful about how we're using that. It's also important to consider the fact that culture has a close relationship not only to urban-rural systems that we've been talking about, these urban-rural differences, but culture has had different relationships to prior, and some of these still exist, other environmental demographic systems, from nomadic foraging, settled agrarianism, pastoral nomadism. Looked at in a historic sense, the transition between these has been fueled by cultural innovations, right? Different technologies and ideas basically have led to the change in how people use their environment, including urban-rural systems. But the culture within each of these stages or system types has also changed. For instance, nomadic foraging groups tend to be very egalitarian. A lot of anthropologists have studied more contemporary nomadic foraging groups, and there are gender dynamics, but there are also more gender equality than say under settled agrarianism. A lot of agrarian cultures become more dominated by uh, patriarchal kind of culture. Pastoral nomadism usually evolves with chiefdoms, which also tend to be male dominated. So those tend to be highly male oriented or patriarchal. And so, yeah, these you could just kind of assume, or not, it's probably not the right word, but infer from these different systems some cultural dynamics. So it's not unique to urban rural systems, but that is our main focus at this time. Uh, but thinking more about how culture interacts, technology is one of the key ingredients. So the technology includes ideas. It's not just gadgets, but domestication of plants and animals, of course. That was a big one. And it's not that nomadic foragers didn't know how to grow plants or domesticate animals, just did not lead to sedentary villages for quite some time. The plow, of course, really led to agricultural societies, along with iron tools and weapons being significant for pastoral nomads. And the wagon was especially critical for that. But wagons were also important for the first cities because cities rely on such a vast quantity of resources to be imported on a daily basis that without wagons it's very hard to support an urban population. Of course, now we don't use wagons, we use semi trucks and we use trains and we use giant boats, but same basic idea. But looking ahead and looking at contemporary cultural innovation, a lot of it has to do with communication and transportation, and those technologies are being used to better coordinate the urban-rural systems that exist. But again, the worldviews, the religious beliefs, ideologies, all tend to shift with changes in the environmental demography. Thank you.